In a small town, nestled between the mountains and a seemingly endless forest, there stands a house with a dark and terrifying history. This is the story of a place where nightmares come to life, where the line between the living and the dead blurs, and where those who enter often don't come out. Welcome to the house at the edge of the forest. Welcome to Cosmos World, where the shadows whisper and the unknown lurks around every corner. Brace yourself for a journey into the darkest mysteries. Built in the early 1900s by the Evans family, the house was once a grand and beautiful home. Situated at the edge of a vast forest, it was meant to be a peaceful retreat from the bustle of city life. But peace was the last thing the Evans family found. Shortly after moving in, the Evans family began experiencing strange occurrences. Doors would slam shut on their own, cold spots would appear in the warmest rooms, and at night, they would hear whispers coming from the walls. As the weeks passed, the disturbances grew more intense. The youngest daughter, Emily, began sleepwalking, always ending up at the edge of the forest, staring into the darkness. One night, she vanished without a trace. The search for Emily went on for days, but she was never found. Her disappearance marked the beginning of a series of tragedies. The father, overcome with guilt, took his own life. The mother was found dead in the house a week later, her face frozen in a mask of terror. The only surviving member of the family, the eldest son, left town and was never seen again. After the Evans family tragedy, the house was abandoned. Locals claimed it was cursed, and no one dared to enter. Over the years, the forest began to reclaim the land, and the house was forgotten. Until now. In the present day, the house was purchased by a young couple, Sarah and Mark, looking for a fresh start away from the city. They knew the house had a history, but they didn't believe in ghosts. To them, it was just a bargain, a place to call their own. But from the moment they stepped inside, they could feel that something was wrong. The air was heavy, the rooms were cold, and there was an unsettling sense of being watched. That first night, the disturbances began. It started with small things. Footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, doors creaking open on their own. Mark dismissed it as the house settling, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. In the middle of the night, Sarah was awoken by the same whispers that had haunted the Evans family all those years ago. They seemed to come from the walls, the floor, and even the air itself. She followed the sound, leading her to the basement. In the basement, Sarah discovered something the real estate agent hadn't mentioned. A door hidden behind a stack of old boxes. It was locked, but the key was in the lock, as if waiting for her to find it. The room beyond was small and dark, the walls covered in strange symbols that Sarah didn't recognize. In the corner stood an old, dusty mirror, its surface covered with a thick layer of grime. But as she wiped it clean, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the mirror, Sarah saw her reflection, but it was wrong, twisted and distorted. Behind her, shadows moved, taking shape into figures that shouldn't have been there. She screamed and ran upstairs, but the damage was done. When Mark found her, she was in a state of shock, unable to speak. The next morning, she tried to tell him what she had seen, but the words wouldn't come. The house had taken hold of her, and the horrors were just beginning. As the days passed, the haunting escalated. The house became a living nightmare, with objects flying across rooms, apparitions appearing in the windows, and the whispers growing louder and more insistent. Mark tried to rationalize the events, blaming it on stress and exhaustion, but Sarah knew the truth. The house was alive, and it wanted them. The house began to take control of Sarah, whispering to her constantly, telling her things she didn't want to hear. She became withdrawn, her eyes hollow, and her movements robotic. Mark watched in horror as the woman he loved slipped away. One night, Mark found Sarah standing in front of the mirror again, but this time it was different. Her reflection was no longer hers. It was something else, something dark and twisted, and it was smiling. Desperate to save her, Mark tried to drag Sarah out of the house, but the house wouldn't let them go. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows came to life, and the whispers turned into screams. The house began to collapse, the very structure twisting and groaning as if in pain. The forest outside seemed to come alive, the trees reaching out as if trying to consume them. Mark knew they had to escape, but Sarah was no longer herself. In a desperate act, Mark grabbed the mirror and smashed it, hoping to break the house's hold on Sarah. The house screamed in agony, the walls shaking, and the whispers turning into a deafening roar. As the house collapsed around them, Mark managed to drag Sarah outside, just as the forest seemed to stop in its tracks. They watched in horror as the house was swallowed by the earth, leaving nothing but a crater where it once stood. Mark and Sarah left the town, vowing never to return. But the house, or whatever evil resided within it, was not done with them. Even now, they can still hear the whispers, calling them back to the edge of the forest, where nightmares become reality. Deep in the heart of the Whispering Woods lies a darkness that few have dared to explore. For centuries, locals have whispered of the strange occurrences and the chilling disappearances that have plagued the area. This is the story of one family's encounter with the malevolent force that lurks within the woods. The Thompsons were looking for a fresh start. After years of city life, they decided to move to the countryside where they could reconnect with nature and each other. The Whispering Woods seemed like the perfect escape, but they had no idea of the horrors that awaited them. At first, the cabin seemed like a dream come true, but as night fell, the woods began to reveal their true nature. It started with the whispers. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, like the wind rustling through the leaves. But Emily knew something was off. The whispers seemed to be calling her name. Curiosity turned to fear as the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from the woods, beckoning her to come closer. Drawn by an unseen force, Emily found herself outside, walking toward the trees. The whispers surrounded her, filling her mind with thoughts that weren't her own. And then she saw it, a shadowy figure, barely visible in the darkness, watching her from the trees. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else until suddenly, silence. Her parents found her at the edge of the woods, standing motionless, her eyes wide with terror. She couldn't remember how she got there or what she had seen, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. The whispers were just the beginning. As the days passed, the presence in the woods grew stronger, more aggressive. The Thompsons tried to ignore it, but the signs were everywhere. Doors slamming shut, the objects moving on their own, and an overwhelming sense of dread that hung over the cabin like a dark cloud. Jake, the youngest, seemed particularly affected. He would often stand at the edge of the woods, staring into the trees, as if something was calling to him. Emily, too, began to change. She became withdrawn, her once bright personality dimming as the whispers invaded her mind. She would often speak in a low voice, repeating words that made no sense, words that she claimed were being whispered to her by the forest people. Desperate for help, the parents reached out to the local townspeople, but their pleas were met with silence. The locals knew better than to get involved with the Whispering Woods. The final night in the cabin was one of terror. The whispers were louder than ever, filling the house with a cacophony of voices. The air was thick with fear, and the Thompsons knew they had to leave. But the forest wouldn't let them go. The doors and windows were sealed shut, the very walls of the cabin closing in on them. The whispers turned to screams, the voices demanding a sacrifice. In a trance, Emily walked toward the door, her movements controlled by the unseen force. Her parents tried to stop her, but they were powerless, held back by the same malevolent entity that had haunted them from the start. As the door burst open, the shadowy figure from the woods appeared, reaching out for Emily. But just as it touched her, a blinding light filled the room, and the figure let out a blood-curdling scream. When the light faded, the whispers were gone. The family found themselves outside the cabin, the storm clouds clearing. But the cabin was in ruins, as if it had been abandoned for decades. The woods were silent, the presence gone, but the scars remained. The Thompsons left the Whispering Woods that night, vowing never to speak of what had happened. But the forest is still there, waiting, whispering, calling out to those who dare to listen. Tucked away in the remote wilderness of Eastern Europe lies a village that time forgot. No maps show its location, and no roads lead to its gates, except one, a path that few have dared to tread. This is the story of a group of documentary filmmakers who went in search of the lost village of Velkov, only to discover that some places are forgotten for a reason. Velkov was once a thriving community, but it vanished mysteriously in the late 1800s. Rumors of curses, strange rituals, and an ancient evil have surrounded the village ever since. Driven by curiosity and a thirst for truth, the filmmakers set out to uncover what really happened. Equipped with the latest technology and a burning desire to make a name for themselves, they believed they were prepared for anything. But the village had other plans. As they neared the village, the forest grew darker, the air thicker with an unnatural stillness. Birds stopped singing, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires. The GPS signal faded, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the gloom. At last, they reached Velkov. The village was exactly as the old texts described: crumbling houses, overgrown streets, and an eerie silence that weighed on their minds. But something was off. The village felt alive, as if it had been waiting for them. The deeper they ventured into Velkov, the more unsettling it became. The houses were untouched by time, as if the villagers had simply vanished one day, leaving everything behind. But who or what could have caused such a thing? It wasn't long before they discovered the symbols, carved into walls, doors, even trees, the marks of an ancient, forgotten religion, one that worshipped dark forces long banished from history. As night fell, the village seemed to close in around them. The fog thickened, and the air grew cold. But it wasn't just the weather. It was as if the village itself was coming alive, awakening from a long slumber. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but soon they grew louder, more insistent. Voices speaking in a language none of them understood, beckoning them deeper into the village. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the air was thick with a sense of impending doom. And then they began to disappear. First, David went to investigate a strange noise and never came back. Then Mike heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing there. Nothing but darkness. Panic set in as Anna and Clara realized they were alone, trapped in a village that was slowly consuming them. In their search for their friends, they found only abandoned gear and more symbols, symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams, and the shadows pressed in, suffocating them with fear. In the heart of the village, they found the source of the evil, a stone altar, ancient and stained with blood. The villagers hadn't just vanished, they had been sacrificed, their souls consumed by the dark forces they once worshipped. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. The fog turned solid, trapping them in place as the shadows closed in, their forms becoming more defined. Twisted, grotesque figures of the long-dead villagers, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. In a final act of desperation, Clara sacrificed herself, pushing Anna out of the fog's grasp. Anna ran, the village closing in around her, the whispers screaming in her ears. She found the road, barely making it back to the car. But as she drove away, the village began to fade, disappearing into the fog as if it had never been there. But Velkov wasn't done with her. As she drove through the endless forest, the whispers fell silent. But when she glanced in the rearview mirror, the village was still there, closer, impossibly close, as if it was following her. Velkov had chosen her, and there would be no escape. For over a century, the North Point Lighthouse has guided ships safely to shore, its light cutting through the darkest nights and fiercest storms. But the lighthouse holds a dark secret, one that has been buried beneath the waves of time. This is the story of the final lighthouse keeper, a man who discovered that some lights are meant to remain extinguished. In the summer of 1953, Edward Ramsey, a former naval officer, took on the role of lighthouse keeper at North Point. The previous keeper had disappeared without a trace, leaving the lighthouse abandoned for months. Ramsey, seeking solitude and a fresh start, was eager to take on the challenge. The journey to the lighthouse was treacherous, but Ramsey was determined. Little did he know the true danger lay not in the sea, but in the very walls of the lighthouse itself. Ramsey's first night at the lighthouse was uneventful, though the isolation weighed heavily on him. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the sea roared outside, but inside, all was quiet. Too quiet. But as midnight approached, the light went out, without warning, without reason. Ramsey awoke to a cold darkness, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. He climbed the stairs to the beacon, only to find it in perfect working order. Yet it refused to stay lit. Over the next few days, Ramsey began to notice odd occurrences. The light flickering at odd intervals, objects moving on their own, and shadows that seemed to shift and sway in the corners of his vision. And then came the voices. Faint at first, like the distant echo of a ship's crew, but they grew louder each night, whispering words Ramsey could not understand. They seemed to come from the walls, from the very stones of the lighthouse, and no matter where he went, the voices followed. Determined to uncover the truth, Ramsey scoured the lighthouse from top to bottom. It was during one of these searches that he found a hidden door, a trapdoor in the floor that led to a dark, narrow staircase descending into the depths of the cliff. With each step, the air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. At the bottom, Ramsey found a small, forgotten room carved into the rock itself. Inside were relics of the past, old charts, rusted tools, and a large, ancient chest. The chest contained the journals of past lighthouse keepers, each one detailing strange occurrences similar to those Ramsey was experiencing. But the final entry was different, a warning not to open the small ornate box that lay within the chest, bound by chains. But curiosity got the better of Ramsey. Ignoring the warnings, he opened the box. unleashing a dark force that had been sealed away for centuries. The mist that poured from the box was not of this world. It was cold, malevolent, and alive. From that moment on, the lighthouse was no longer a sanctuary. The light refused to stay lit, no matter how many times Ramsay repaired it. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows, those shadows that had once lurked in the corners, now moved with purpose, as if they were watching him, waiting. Ramsay's logbook entries became increasingly erratic, filled with desperate pleas for help and incoherent ramblings about figures in the fog. He was no longer alone. The spirits of the past keepers, or perhaps something far worse, had returned to claim him. In the final days, Ramsay could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. The shadows closed in, and the voices reached a fever pitch. He knew he had to confront the darkness he had unleashed, but the power of the lighthouse was too strong. In a last-ditch effort, Ramsay tried to relight the beacon, hoping to banish the darkness once and for all. But the light flickered and died, and the shadows closed in, consuming him entirely. His final scream echoed through the night, carried away by the wind, as the lighthouse fell silent once more. In the days that followed, the lighthouse fell into darkness. The light never shone again, and the few who dared to approach the cliffs spoke of a cold, malevolent presence that seemed to watch them from the shadows. The legend of North Point grew, a warning to all who ventured too close, and the secret of the lighthouse keeper's fate was buried beneath the waves, where it would remain until someone else was foolish enough to uncover it.